Hello again, everyone. So for this video, what we're going to look at is kind of the period where we see the civil rights movement beginning to fragment and really sort of losing cohesion, which occurs, ironically enough, very shortly after the moment of its greatest triumph, the passage of the Voting Rights Act in August of 1965. Um, the civil rights movement in the United States arguably reaches its apex in the United States in August of 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But within literally days of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, events would have begin transpiring in the United States that would ultimately cause the civil rights movement to begin unraveling, would ultimately bring about a wave of urban unrest and violence that would plague American cities for the rest of the decade, and which would ultimately foreshadow the rise of a more militant brand of civil rights activism that would, in its own manner, spark an intense white backlash. Um, Now, this event, there's a number of reasons why 1965 is important to understanding this. Um, 1965, as I mentioned previously, is a year that marks both the high water mark of the civil rights movement and of the Johnson presidency. But it is also the year that arguably marks the beginning of the beginning of the decline of both. And the reason is very simple. The thing that ties both of those things together is Vietnam. 1965 is also the year that the war in Vietnam becomes an American war. And that is something that will end up having a direct impact on the civil rights movement and on the way the public sees President Lyndon Johnson and liberal reform more broadly, that will prove to be deeply corrosive to both. Now, um, to kind of the first things first, to back up a little bit. Before 1965, there had always been tension within the civil rights movement between various schools of thought, if you will, within activist circles, between those who championed a more moderate, slow-going approach and championed the usage of the courts as a means of securing civil rights advancements. This was a strategy that had largely been adopted by the NAACP from the 1930s onward and had ultimately borne some rather significant and important fruit for the civil rights cause, most notably the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. Um, but that approach wasn't shared by everybody. Many people felt that the approach advocated by the NAACP, which was disproportionately representative of the small black middle class and professional class, was not fast enough to deal with economic and social inequalities produced by segregation. And so you end up seeing this major kind of, you know, tension between the NAACP and more moderate groups like it and more radical activists like Martin Luther King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and various other groups that, like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, subscribe to the philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience, like John Lewis's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, amongst others. So that's where there's this area of tension is between those more moderate groups and the more radical groups of demand, engaging in high profile acts of civil disobedience, what they call direct action, as a means of applying significant political pressure on the powers that be to take actions that they otherwise wouldn't take, for fear of alienating various groups. So that's one source of tension between the moderates and the more radical, nonviolent protesters. Um, but there's also considerable tension between those like King and Lewis, who although advocating radical acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, still fundamentally embrace nonviolence as their core tenet. And those like Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, the group that he becomes the spokesman of in the early 1960s, that um, while not necessarily openly embracing violence, definitely don't rule it out. Um, Malcolm X famously begins talking in the early 1960s of securing black liberation, and of securing and really encourages this kind of black separatism that has deep roots in American history going back to the 1920s, and Marcus Garvey and his uh, various campaigns and what have you. Um, and so Malcolm X and people like him, they don't completely rule out the use of violence as a means of achieving liberation. They also oftentimes reject the integrationist language that King and Lewis and others adopt as part of their nonviolent strategy. King's ideas in and of themselves are quite radical, as are Lewis's, but they still speak in the language of, not black separatism or militantism, but of integration into the broader fabric of American society. Um, for a time, this tension between the more militant, um, more separatist elements of the civil rights movement, like those represented by Malcolm X, served a useful purpose to people like Martin Luther King and John Lewis, because it enabled them to, basically it enabled their ideas to look a lot more moderate to white Americans than they probably would have otherwise. And so it had served up until a certain point to be pretty useful to the movement. And, this sort of dichotomy, of course, is very well represented in popular culture. Stan Lee, when he created the X-Men in the early 1960s, actually modeled the two principal characters of that comic book, Dr. Charles Xavier and, um, Magneto, Eric Lyncher, off of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, respectively. So, anyway, um, so that is, something that had been useful for the civil rights movement to a point, because, people like King were able to say, well, this is where things are going to go if we don't do some things. And that scared people. And I think that was part of what helped the movement achieve a degree of mainstream respectability, a degree of mainstream support in the mid 1960s and 1964 and 1965, that it had not really enjoyed beforehand. Um, but ultimately, that would not prove to be the case long term. In the end, um, the nonviolent civil disobedience and integrationist approach advocated by King was increasingly on the way out in 1965, whereas the more militant stances previously advocated by Malcolm X, who was assassinated in Harlem in February of 1965, ironically enough, after he had renounced um, violence, um, was increasingly ascendant within the movement. And there's a number of reasons why that is. Part of the reason why the more militant rhetoric, um, which came to be encapsulated by a single phrase, Black Power, a term coined in 1966 by the new head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, after John Lewis left the organization. Um, One of the reasons why the calls to Black Power gained a greater degree of popularity after 1965 is because fundamentally the civil rights movement only dealt with one part of segregation and racism in the United States, its legal manifestations. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and various other measures really only addressed what was known as de jure racism, or the various legalized manifestations of racism that were written into law. It did not deal with de facto racism, or the day-to-day, kind of millions of forms of, casual, racism that occurred on a day-to-day basis. Um, Notably, even then, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not attempt to address one of the central issues that produced enormous economic inequality between white and black America, housing discrimination. That would ultimately not be addressed until the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, with the passage of the Housing Act of 1968, which finally banned discrimination in housing and jury selection. Um, so, one of the major reasons why people grow increasingly impatient with the civil rights movement after 1965 is because it had really only scratched the surface of the various kind of day-to-day forms of racial discrimination that people faced, and it did absolutely nothing to deal with the economic causes of issues that racism presented in the United States. And that's something that ends up manifesting itself from 1965 onward in these urban riots. Ironically, within a week of President Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the crowning achievement of civil rights activism in the 1960s, uh, a massive riot erupts in Los Angeles in the Watts neighborhood, a largely black neighborhood housing around 250,000 people. Um, the Watts riot, which, like many of the subsequent riots that would erupt in American cities like Newark and Detroit and Philadelphia and various others over the next 4 years, including the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., were caused by a combination of factors. Hostility with the local police force was one of them. In spite of the fact that police forces were tasked with patrolling areas with largely black populations in the 1960s, most urban police departments in the United States were pretty white and had very few African American officers on their payroll. And so this created tension between members of those communities and the police, with many members of those communities feeling like the police were essentially an occupying force. And so incidences, allegations of police brutality were common, and relations between the police and local residents were oftentimes the flashpoint behind these various riots, as was the case with Watts in 1965, a riot that eventually resulted in millions of dollars of property damage and would eventually claim the lives of nearly 36 people. Another factor that contributed to these riots, beyond poor community relations between the African American community and local police departments, was the scarcity of access to quality education and employment opportunities. During the great post-war boom of suburban expansion during the late 40s and the 1950s, millions of white Americans left crowded urban centers like Detroit and Chicago and St. Louis and others to build homes in the suburbs. When they left, they took with them their property taxes and the revenue that cities needed to run as a result of these things. And so by the early 1960s, with increasing numbers of people fleeing cities for the suburbs, many cities began to struggle heavily with the ability to pay for their schools and basic infrastructure, their roads and sewers and the like. And along with the departure of large numbers of residents and along with it their tax revenue, you also have, of course, the departure of many jobs from cities. And so, because of endemic housing discrimination, because of that practice of redlining, of refusing to rent or sell dwellings to African American or minority families in the suburbs, many African Americans find themselves forced to live in areas that suddenly don't have the tax revenue to pay for good schools, so their schools become overcrowded. The quality of education declines substantially. They have limited, infrastructure and resources, and of course, jobs become scarce. So there's a very significant economic component to this growing sense of frustration that periodically boils over in these urban uprisings, like the ones, these long hot summers as they come to be known, that erupt every year in the United States between 1964 or 1965 and the end of the decade. Um, uh, the most the worst ones occurring between 1965 and 1968. Um, so economics is part of it. Lack of access to education, lack of access to good, well-paying jobs, unionized jobs, jobs that pay a wage that enables people to, you know, provide those sort of things for their family. Poor community relations with the police. Um, but after 1965, another factor inserts itself into this dynamic. Beyond the aforementioned factors, after 1965, another thing that leads to growing radicalization within the civil rights movement and growing militancy is the disproportionate effect that the war in Vietnam has on the Black community in particular and working class and poor communities more broadly. Um, as I mentioned in the previous video, the war in Vietnam is a racial and a class war. And because of the fact that one of the few avenues available to African Americans for any measure of social or economic equality with whites in the United States in the early 1960s was to join the military, one of the few places where they could find promotion on the basis of merit. Um, when the U.S. mobilizes to fight the war in Vietnam in 1965, a disproportionate share of the frontline servicemen who fight that war, at least in the early stages of the war, are African Americans. Um, in 1965 and 1966, even though African Americans only comprise around 11 or 12% of the population, which is still the same as it is today, um, in spite of only comprising around 10 or between 11 and 12% of the population, in the first 2 years of the American phase of the war in Vietnam, African American troops make up more than a third of all frontline troops in frontline units sent to the Vietnam War, and they make up more than a quarter of casualties during this figure. So the number of African Americans killed or wounded in Vietnam is out of proportion to their numbers in the general population by a factor of at least two. And so the fact that the war hits African American communities particularly hard in terms of, losing people killed or wounded, or being drafted to go fight the war, because of course being poor, they lack the avenues available to rich suburban white kids for draft deferments or finding jobs in munitions factories or various other means of avoiding service in the war. That makes a lot of people very angry, of course. And so that is yet another layer that adds to this growing sense of militancy that begins to take shape. Now, this militancy, again, never completely displaces the more integrationist approach advocated by Martin Luther King and others like him, but it does increasingly attract an increased amount of media attention. The media obsesses over figures like Stokely Carmichael and his calls to Black Power, and they obsess over small but highly visible groups like the Black Panthers in Oakland, who begin brandishing weapons in public and engaging in what they call cop watching operations, periodically engaging in gun battles with the police. Um, Interestingly enough, this is what would, and ironically enough, it's this kind of thing that would lead then Governor Ronald Reagan to and begin enacting California's well-known gun control regimen in 1967 when he passed the Mulford Act, which forbid the open carrying of firearms. So, ironically enough, California's rather famously stringent gun control regime actually began in the 1960s as part of a conservative reaction against the proclivities of groups like the Black Panthers and others like them. But you know, the fear that these urban uprisings and the disproportionate amount of attention generated to groups like the Black Panthers and others like them certainly contributes to a increasing white backlash. Now, that white backlash probably was coming regardless because of the successes of the civil rights movement, but certainly the fears of urban violence and the kind of heightened sense of dread that groups like the Black Panthers inspire and various others likewise contribute to a mounting societal backlash that would eventually prove to be very, very highly influential on American politics. The rather dramatic rightward shift that would occur in the United States starting in 1968 can largely be seen as a strong reaction against both the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, whose rise I will discuss in the next video.